Work with Harmony Family Center. We have a contract with the state of Tennessee to provide education advocacy services for some families in the state of Tennessee. And so when I'll be talking about functional behavior assessments, definitely I do a lot of work in Knox County schools. In fact, we have a grant from United Way and from Lost and Family Foundation to provide free education advocacy for families in community schools and then also in Central, Austin East, and Fulton High School. So I certainly am in Knox County quite a lot, but we do this work across the state of Tennessee. And so when I get to see functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans, I get to see how this works out across the state of Tennessee. So some of the things that we'll be talking about and some of the pitfalls to avoid and best practices, just know that I'm not singling out Knox County at all. This is, I get to see this work and not work across the state. And then also I get to see really well written FBAs and BIPs, and then some that need some additional supports. So, and also I want to say that when we're talking about what needs to be included, what doesn't need to be included, I'm referencing state requirements and federal requirements, and certainly not speaking on behalf of Knox County Schools. So I just want to make that clear. So we will talk now about functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. I do want to leave some time at the end for us to have some questions if you have them. So what is an FBA? It's a functional behavior assessment. So when our kiddos at school have specific behavioral challenges or intense behavioral challenges, that means that we need a little bit more information about the student. We need to think a little bit more. We need some more data. We're always data driven about our student to help us understand that student's motivations, the student's environment, which may be increasing the likelihood of problematic behaviors, what we can do to address those, understanding that behavior is communication, and that our students are usually working towards some sort of reasoning behind their behavior, even if they don't recognize what that reasoning is, and that we can then address the behavior through rewards that incentivize good behavior and consequences that disincentivize the behavior that we don't want to see. So when is it done? These are just some of the reasons. Always a functional behavior assessment. The decision to do any assessment is a team decision with the parents, sometimes the student, depending on their age, with teacher, staff, and sometimes with the district as well. And so, but these are some of the reasons that an FBA will be done. So when a student's behavior impedes the learning or their learning or the learning of others, or when a student is suspended more than 10 days of the school year, sometimes when a student is placed in a more restrictive environment, that may mean that the child is going to be at an alternative school. We will be looking at an FBA to see why has this behavior been happening and what can we do to help the student through it. So what is the goal of an FBA? Why do we need to do one at all? I was telling Sue when I got on here, I was in another county a few years ago, and we were needing an FBA, and we had agreed for the FBA to be done. And we got to the meeting where we were supposed to be reviewing the FBA, and instead we were sitting down and being asked to write the FBA together. That does not help us to bring in someone who understands well-written FBAs, that has seen the students' behavior for themselves and has some expertise in evaluating the students' behavior. It was just a room full of people making their best guesses, some of whom had been the recipients of the child's behavior and we're not pleased. And so what we want to do with an FBA is to rather standardize and be able to make predictable responses to the child's behavior, leading to a BIP, but also to really try to get at the root of the child's behavior so that we can help them meet that function. So we're looking at the underlying reasons. This is why it's called a functional behavior assessment. We're looking at the function. What function is this behavior serving for that student? That doesn't mean that the student always knows what the function of the behavior is. We'll talk a little bit later about what can be some of the reasons for the behavior, but sometimes the child is trying to avoid certain tasks or negative feelings. So at Harmony, we work quite a lot. In part of our work, we work quite a lot with children who've experienced intense trauma. And so you might have a child who has PTSD or is very hypervigilant. And so the behavior of escape can be really intense with children. And so they might elope out of the classroom. The child doesn't really always even recognize that they're eloping, and they certainly are not always planning to elope. It is just something that their brain comes up with in order to escape the intensity of the emotion at the moment. But the function of the eloping would be to escape when they feel unsafe. But you might have a student who's falling asleep in class. That function may also be escape. They may be avoiding work that is difficult. It may also be environmental factors. Maybe they are not getting sleep at home. And so we always want to try the best we can to understand the function of the behavior so that we can meet that function. Even when that function is escape, we can still help meet that function for the student, but in a way that doesn't impede their learning. We want to get at a solution for the student that doesn't just involve punishing them into cooperation. We know that doesn't always work at all. It's certainly not a good long-term motivator for a child. And so we want to get at the function of behavior so we can support them in a more positive way. So key components for the functional behavior assessment, and these come from the state of Tennessee makes available their guidelines for functional behavior assessments for the state, and then each district has their own form and implements data collection for the FBA as they see fit, but working through the guidelines from the state. So the state wants districts to interview the student, to interview the teachers and the parents. And this is not just an interview of how do you feel about this student. This is a lot of data collection that happens along the way. The data collection for the teachers will involve what was the behavior, when was that behavior happening, how long did that behavior go on for. So we're looking for frequency, how often is it happening? We're looking for duration, how long is it happening for? And we're looking for intervals in between the behavior. We're also looking at what was happening in the classroom right before the behavior happened. Was it a time when the student was required to do individual work, or was this happening during a transition between classes? Did it happen in the hallway? Is it happening in the cafeteria and it's very loud? What all was happening for the student, but right before the behavior happened, and that would be the antecedent. We want to look at the document reviews. That means that we want to look at how many times has the student been suspended for this behavior or had PEC or RLC or ISS or any of the other acronyms that we have for student behavioral needs. How often has the student been punished for this behavior? What punishments have seemed to benefit the student and what has not really worked. If we have a student who likes to escape work and we're taking them out of the classroom, is that really helping to prevent this behavior again, or is it promoting this behavior? So that's where document review can be really helpful. And then when we can, we want to do observations. And so the person writing the FBA, the state of Tennessee and the federal government do not set the standard for who will be doing the observations or writing the FBA. It does need to have be someone with knowledge of the student, and so we want to have observations there. It can often be a special education teacher or a behavioralist. Sometimes I've seen across the state an educational psychologist do the observations. It just depends. And so, and it also depends on the severity of the behavior for the student. But we want to see observations. Again, we're looking for frequency, duration, and intervals for the student. Again, the setting, where is this happening? What class is this happening for the student? And what is the antecedent? What is happening right before this happens? Then we want to look at what is the desired behavior we want to see from the student. And of course, that can be fairly obvious. So if the targeted behavior, the behavior that the student is doing that we don't want to see is eloping, running out of the classroom, then we might want to see the student being able to sit at their desk for the entirety of the classroom, or we might want to see the student ask for a break when they need one rather than running out of the classroom. But we want to say, as a group, as a team, we have decided that this is the behavior that we want to have from the student, as well as this is the behavior that we need to target for the student. And we generally want to have no more than 3 behaviors, which can be difficult for schools to narrow down for some of our students. But for some of our other students, target behavior may be there may be fewer than 3, but generally we don't want to have more than 3. It just gets confusing at that point, and it gets harder to implement the FBA and the BIP. And then we want to talk about what replacement behavior we want. So, so the desired behavior may be to be able to sit in the classroom for the entirety of the class. The target behavior would be the elopement. Replacement behavior, I have seen FBAs that just say, don't do the target behavior. But that's not really a replacement behavior. So we want to find a behavior that still serves the function that the student needs, but is a healthier and more helpful behavior. So that might be that the student asks for a break outside of the classroom or a break within the classroom. If the targeted behavior is that they are saying really negative and insulting things to their classmates, maybe the child has a long history of trauma, and this is their way of feeling like they are safe. We have written an FBA before where the desired behavior was that they have fewer negative thoughts about the students around them, and that they keep these thoughts to themselves. A replacement behavior, we started with that the student could write because they could not keep the negative words and thoughts to themselves. We had them begin to write their feelings down, and that way it was less of an issue between that student and their neighbors. Those students surrounding this child were not having to hear every thought that this child had about them, but the child was still able to express their frustration and fear. We eventually were working toward the desired behavior, which was that the student felt safer and did not feel the need to express how upset they were and really could put into context that they were not, in fact, in danger in that moment and did not have to push anyone away. So, FBA data collection and review. Um, so we want to put the reason that we are having the FBA. So if we look at, and I've got resources at the end or references at the end where you can find this information from the state of Tennessee, and it follows a pathway through the form. But we want to start with the reason for the FBA. Why are we doing this FBA? To begin with. And so it might be that the child has had a placement to a more restrictive environment. It might be that the child has had a manifestation determination hearing, and this is not, their behavior was not found to be a manifestation of their behavior. And so we have to figure out, well, what further is going on for this child. It might be that they are continually being suspended or given out of the classroom punishment for their behavior, and we really need to get down to the meat of it and figure out why this is happening. And then it also could be that the student is being unsafe at school, and we need to continue to dig into why. And again, we want to look through for the staff interview, which is lengthy and requires its own form for that. For the family interview to see, of course, behavior at home and behavior at school don't always match up. We're looking at different relationships that students have at school versus at home, but also the environment, of course, is very different. But we do want to see with the family interview, we want to ask what works for this student at home. When you need to incentivize this student, what can we do for them? Or what are the student's strengths? Is this child really relationally based? And so therefore, when they are really struggling in class, maybe that informs us that this child may need to, instead of working toward a reward or an incentive of a thing, maybe they're working more toward a reward of being with their favorite person at school, their favorite staff member, and maybe helping them do a task. Or it can inform when we are writing the behavior intervention plan that maybe sitting with the student or having their favorite person come and sit with this student when they are experiencing a crisis is the way to go for them because they are so relationally based. And if they don't have a relationship with the staff member that's trying to intervene, it's not going to help. And then, of course, we want to talk to the student. This is based on their age, but we want to see if the student can give us any insight into their own behavior, especially any setting or antecedent that's happening that they can recognize is leading them into this behavior. That can be really helpful for us. And then, of course, records review again. We want to list the target behaviors that we are looking for. We want to do systematic observation. So again, we are observing where is this happening? What is happening right before? What was the intensity of the behavior? Did the child elope inside the classroom or did they elope outside the classroom? Did they make it all the way to the street and before they could be brought back into the school? How often is this happening? And what was attempted in order to avoid the behavior before? And that can take a really long time. We're going to talk in a minute how long FBAs can take to do, but a well-written FBA and a well-observed FBA take time. And so we want to make sure that we give that time to the school to be able to do their work. And then we're looking at a hypothesized function. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then a summary of the data. We always want to look at what does the data say. That way we aren't going off of vibes. We can't really go off of vibes at school. We do have to go off of data that protects the student. It protects the school, and it keeps the student as well protected as possible. So understanding function, I'm going to read for you directly from the state of Tennessee. It is important to recognize that a student's behavior is a source of communication and is addressing a need for the student. So this is not just something that the student is being a brat and wants. This is addressing an actual need that the student has. That need is neutral. It may be that this need is a need for loads of attention from classmates. We are not putting a label on this need as to whether it is a valid need or an invalid need. It just is. It's like a feeling. It just is. It is neither good nor bad. So it is addressing a need for the student. By listening to the student through their behavior, school teams can support the student in addressing the need and teaching strategies that the student can apply throughout their school years and into post-secondary and careers. As part of your child's education, the school is moving your child towards independence. And that independence is going to come through their post-secondary life. So if your child has an IEP, you'll notice as they get older and they enter their teen years, they're looking more and more at post-secondary. What is this child going to do when they're outside of school? Do they have post-secondary skills in order to advance their education or their career? And so in addressing the behavior, we are working towards independence for this child as they get closer to graduation. So this comes directly from the state of Tennessee again. We are always seeking to obtain something or to avoid escape something. When I don't want to do a certain task for work, and instead I get up and I go get myself a Coke and I come back to the task, I have been avoiding the task. I might be avoiding an activity, but I might also be seeking an item. I might be seeking something that will give me a caffeine boost and maybe even sensory stimulation. I might and I feel like that is going to wake me up. So am I avoiding the task temporarily? Yes, I am. Am I seeking items, material, sensory stimulation? Yes, I am. Those are not necessarily negative things as long as I can meet those functions to come back to the task. Those functions are actually helping me come back to the task. So what we want to do is build in, if the child is wanting to avoid tasks and activities, what we want to do is build in standards for the child so that we can help them build up their capacity and their stamina for work, but we also want to give them milder ways to escape that don't involve either scrolling on their Chromebook or running out of the room. So we want to give them smaller ways so that we can dose the stress to them of the work and get their toleration for the work built up. We can't pretend like the function doesn't exist, or we can just ignore it and go straight back to work. I would not do well at work if I didn't have moments of escape and seeking items that are helpful to me. That might mean that I use my standing desk for a while. And so I am getting some sensory stimulation. I am getting some better ways to stay attuned to my tasks. And in the end, it is helpful. We'll see a lot about attention in FBAs, either adult attention or peer attention. Sometimes that's avoiding attention. That might mean that the student doesn't use the accommodations that they have in their IEP that would be helpful for them. They're avoiding peer attention. And we might look at that behavior, might look like the student is maybe ditching class to avoid negative peer attention. Maybe the child is not coming to school in order to avoid peer attention, but we often see it as seeking attention. And so we'll see some of our kiddos with some more inattentiveness that will seek peer attention. Some students that would enjoy making their classmates laugh, enjoy being away from the activity, and now we're all having fun instead. And how do we still give them that peer attention, but in a way that doesn't impede their learning or the learning of others? So we never want to pretend like the function doesn't exist or the behavior isn't communication of a need, but that we meet that need in a healthier way. So then an FBA typically, I will say that for everything, typically leads to a behavior intervention plan. It's a team decision. In my experience, 99% of the time, it leads to a behavior intervention plan. So what is a behavior intervention plan? A plan created to address the function of the behavior, promote desired behavior, and apply consequences. So now that we have all of this information that we have gathered for the FBA, what do we do with it? What does that look like on a daily basis? Who gets trained in order to do this? It lays out the entire predictable plan for the student. So it'll be done in response to an FBA. Sometimes it's done after a manifestation determination, a change in placement, change in behavioral needs. When we're redoing the behavior intervention plan, that can be because the student's needs have changed. The other day, I had a student who their behavior intervention plan used to address the student saying really unkind things to their classmates and engaging with their classmates to avoid the work. It was more interesting to fight with their classmates than to do the work. And now, because of the success of the behavior intervention plan and the hard work that the teachers had put in and the students had put in, that student no longer was engaging in this really negative interaction with his peers, but now he was avoiding doing the work in other ways, ways that were less distracting to his fellow classmates, but now he was scrolling on Chromebook a lot. So still avoiding the task, but we needed to change the intervention plan because his behavior had changed. It had evolved. We had had success in his peer interactions, and we had had less success in his avoidance. And so we need to change our tactics, and we needed to write it again as a team. So the goal of the behavior intervention plan, the BIP, some people call it the BIP, the goal of the BIP is to develop a comprehensive, we want to look at this child throughout the day at school, not just the time that they're sitting in the classroom doing work, but also when they are going to their specials or encore classes, when they are going to lunch, when they are transitioning in the classroom, when they're on the playground, all of those things. We want it to be holistic. We want to look at the child as a whole. We want to involve members of staff that are intervening with this child throughout the day. We want it to be consistent. We want the behavior intervention plan to be able to be used no matter what class the child is in and no matter what day it is. So we want to encourage replacement behaviors, minimize targeted behaviors. So those key components are going to be that we're going to relist the target behavior, and we're going to talk about the replacement behavior in the BIP. We want to make sure, this is very important, we want to make sure that we list in the behavior intervention plan what staff is involved. Exactly what staff. This may be well, depending on whether or not the student is in elementary, middle, or high school, and the intensity of the child's behavior. I've got one client that tends to get really angry and start yelling when he is having overwhelming feelings. And so we have staff that are named by their position that are responsible for coming in, sitting with the student while he calms himself, taking the student away for a break. And then we have other staff that are responsible for reviewing the behavior with the student, applying consequences, and then reviewing whether or not we need to apply different consequences, or if we need to start talking about changing settings or antecedents and what other supports we need to give the student. And the same for when they are doing well. We have staff that are responsible for rewarding that student in a specific way for that particular child. So we want to talk about what staff intervention is going to be involved, the level of staff intervention. Again, we want to make sure that that we are giving the child what they need in that moment. I was telling Sue at Harmony, we work really heavily in the neurosequential model of therapeutics, and that talks about a lot of things. But when we are working with students or we're working with our own children, we want to first regulate the child, then relate to the child, then reason with the child. And we can't skip to reason when the child is in dysregulation. But if you have a child who is heavily avoidant of other people and just wants to be left alone when they are really escalated, and then you go and sit and you try to work with that student to help them regulate themselves in that moment, you may not get the response that you want. And so it's important to really know that child and know the intervention that is likely to be the most successful with that child, and to lay that out for all staff. We want to talk about interventions to avoid in that. So having a really long conversation with that student is not going to be successful. Using blaming words are not successful with most students, I would say all students. So we want to stress the interventions that we know don't work specifically for this child, and then we can also have general ones to avoid. We want to talk about instructional strategies. What can we teach this child? What strategies has the child been taught before? Who is going to teach these strategies to the child? How will they know that they can use four square breathing, right? How will they know how to do that? We can't just tell them that they need to use their words. We can't just tell them that they need to calm their bodies. We have to show them how to do that. And so we can talk about instructional strategies, who implements that, how we monitor whether or not those strategies are being taught. Then we want to talk about reinforcers. What specifically works for this child? I'll tell you the story of a kiddo that we worked with for a really long time. This kiddo is just precious. So very young, elementary child, intensely loves bugs. And so you think any reinforcers about bugs are going to work for this child. And that's true. However, any reinforcers about bugs would not work for this child in every situation. You have to think about the reinforcer. So this child was given a bug collector to use on the playground. And this really helped him to use playground time to calm his body. It helped to minimize negative interactions he was having with other students. And so he spent recess collecting bugs. That was wonderful until it was time to come in the classroom again, and he had his little bugs. So what we did instead, and transitions were really hard for this child, walking through a classroom, going from a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity, it was really hard for this child. and was just set him up for negative behavior in the next classroom as well. So what we did instead was he would turn in the bug collector to the staff. The staff would then give him an object, usually a bug sticker that he had collected for that day. And we used it as a reinforcer for his good behavior on the playground. Then he just was staring at this bug sticker all the way through the transition back to his classroom, where he had a journal in which he would take the bug sticker and he would put it in his journal for that day. And that helped not only ease the transition out of where all the bugs were and where he wanted to be into the classroom, but really positively reinforce the behavior we wanted to see, which was that he could transition peacefully. And so for that student, that reinforcer may be obvious, but we have to really think about when to apply this reinforcer and how. And then you want to train your staff in how to implement these, how to, it's so hard for teachers right now. When you have a student who is being very disruptive or is being is having really intense needs, it can be really difficult to find these strategies in that moment. We're all human, and it can be really hard to use our upper level thinking of our brain when we are stressed or if we're mad or frustrated or we have a deadline of things that we need to do. And so having this training in place for the staff is really important. So we have lots of strategies for positive reinforcement, strategies that we want to use for the student. This is not just some sort of reward for doing the bare minimum. We can see that the child struggles with this behavior more than other children do, and they need more support. And so is the child maybe being rewarded for walking quietly through a hallway, even though that's the expectation? Yes, but the goal is that we don't have to give these positive reinforcers all the time, but that we can do this for the child until we see that they're able to do this task on their own. And we're just scaffolding support until they are able to take over for themselves. Environmental adjustments, we want, if the child is really aggravated and becomes very upset in music class because it's very loud, we might want to look at the child being able to leave music class a little bit early in order to have time to calm before they transition to the next class. Or we might want to look at giving them some noise canceling headphones or earbuds to help minimize the amount of noise that they're experiencing. There's loads of things that we can do in order to reduce the triggers for this particular child. And then we want to offer, when we're teaching replacement behaviors, we want to offer alternative actions. It is not always obvious to children at all, no matter their age, what they could choose to do instead, what we want to see instead. And so this just really helps them walk through that process. We want consistent feedback. We want to give regular updates to the child about what they're working for or how they are doing. But we also want to do that for parents and for staff to help monitor progress and adjust where we need to for things that are working and have expired their usefulness, or things that we need to do less of. And increasing supports there, these are all team decisions and all made in an IEP team decision meeting, but there are school-based therapies that are available. There's also OT if the child qualifies, or there are some OT strategies, some sensory strategies we can use for the child. There are social groups at certain schools. There are lots of things that we can look at for increasing the supports for the child if they were to need it. And appropriate consequences, providing consistent, predictable consequences for targeted behavior. So we agree on the consequences in advance, and there is a plan that the student and the parents and the staff can follow. These are questions that parents should ask during an FBA BIP process, which takes a long time. There will be many meetings involved, and there will be time to ask these questions. So when we're talking about implementing the BIP, what positive supports will be used? Sometimes parents can offer the same or coordinating positive supports at home, so the student can be working toward goals at home as well, so we are consistent across the board. What are the consequences for the targeted behavior? That way you can clearly know what's expected of your student. You can talk with the student about the behavior and the consequences of both positive and negative behavior, and you can reinforce. We all want to be on the same page. For parenting, what language can I use at home to be consistent? For one student, it was your job is not, and then they would say what the student is doing. Your job is to, and then they would say what they wanted the student to be doing at that moment. And then the parents were able to use that same language at home so that it's consistent, so the child is hearing the same thing. And what is the student working for? We want to talk about how can we then also have our own reward system at home for this student? What are the long-term goals for the student? Staffing, we want to ask who is responsible for implementing the BIP, making sure that someone is specifically responsible for that. And then who do I contact when I have questions? It can be really confusing when you're sitting at a meeting, knowing who is in charge of what. And honestly, most parents, by the time you get done going all the way around and making introductions, it's hard for them to remember who is having what contact with their students. So asking exactly who do I contact when I have questions. For monitoring, because we want to monitor BIPs really well, how will I know if progress is being made? How are you going to communicate to me progress, non-progress? How will you let me know if there's a problem or if things are going really well? And how often will that be done? And when will we review the BIP? And so are we going to do this annually? Are we going to come back in 6 months because the students' needs are really high and we need to see what's working, what's not? Let's have a conversation about it after we collect some data. Pitfalls to avoid, and I promise you, I have seen all of these and more. And so it's really important to know where an FBA or a BIP can get off track. So State of Tennessee and the United States Department of Education encourage positive supports in a behavior intervention plan. We want to make sure that we are not just using the BIP as a sword against the student to lay out intense consequences. We want to make sure that those consequences are reasonable, that they're proportional to what the student is doing that we don't want them to do. But we want to make sure that we are including ways to support the student. There can be really intense feelings from some staff sometimes, and some parents sometimes too, about rewarding students for doing what other students are doing naturally. There can be very intense feelings about that are beyond what you can address in a meeting. But we know that the school is required to address the behavior and positive reinforcement as well as to have negative consequences. A lack of data can be a pitfall, and so the BIP should be specific to the student. I was just saying that there's a particular district in Middle Tennessee where they have a very generic BIP that they fall back on. So if the student is avoiding work, these are the interventions that they will do for the student. But that's not the way a BIP is supposed to be written. Remember, we're looking at the student, we're observing the student, we know what is driving the student, and we can make interventions that are specific to that student that also get at the reward and consequence structure that works well for them. And it should include observations. And that's exactly why. It's because we need to have something that's very specific for the student. Pitfall would be delayed reporting. So FBA generally falls within the guidelines for other evaluations that can be done at the school. So we want to look around 60 days typically. And that can feel like a lot for students that are really struggling. Sometimes it can be a little shorter if there's a really intense need, but we want to make sure that we are giving the school time to do all this data collection, to do the interviews, and to do the observations. And then the FBA follows the student even in different placements. I had a client one time that I got involved at the very end, and the student had had an open FBA request for a year and a half. And it's because the student, well, I mean, it was because the district was not doing what they were supposed to do, but the student had been moved from school to school to school to school, getting back into their home placement, and then the school that they are zoned for, and then being suspended again and getting sent off for 45 days, and then coming back. And every time the district did not follow the student with their FBA, and so the FBA was never completed in a year and a half, and that's just really unacceptable. So it's important to remember that the FBA follows the student and needs to be completed even through multiple placements. And then a pitfall can be a lack of monitoring. We want to make sure we get timely reports about the effectiveness in the BIP, and that we are writing into the BIP how often it needs to be monitored and how that will be communicated to the staff and to the parents. And then updates should be made as needs change. So for us as parents, we want to make sure that we're understanding why the behavior is happening in the FBA. If we never get to the why in the FBA, then it's not really an FBA, and we need to go back to the drawing board. And it is okay as a parent to say, you have to put in here why this behavior is happening. I don't see why this behavior is happening. Can we readdress this FBA? A good BIP is individualized, function-based, includes teaching prevention, reinforcement, monitoring, and is adjusted as needed. A good FBA and BIP take time, a lot of data collection from all parties. Parent involvement matters a lot. You know your child better than anyone else. They see your child at school, they understand your child at school, but you also know more about your child's history, and your child's personality than the school does. And so bringing in that knowledge is really important and valuable in the meeting. And don't hesitate to ask questions, request meetings, review data, advocate for your child. And obviously, if you need help advocating for your child, it's really important to reach out to an advocate. These are my references. So U.S. Department of Education has, within their IDEA structure, they have lots of information about functional behavior assessments, lots of direction to the states from the Department of Education about functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. And then PBIS is the Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, and that is that has some information, a PDF that can be really interesting about function-based supports throughout the continuum. And it is discussing guidance from the Department of Education. Child Mind Institute is a great resource for families as well, to talk about behavior intervention plans as well, and lots of other ways in which mental health intersects with education. This is my information. You are welcome, if you have questions, to email me, and I'd be happy to answer questions that you have from this webinar. No charge, no fee. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And then our website is harmonyfamilycenter.org. We have free and webinars with a cost as well, about a variety of topics, including trauma, parenting, education advocacy, and the like. And so I do want to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer. That was a lot of talking, you guys, and a lot of listening.
It was a lot.
Thanks.
If you will put those in the chat box, and Penny, I'd be happy to read them to you if you want to look at them either way. And I apologize, I forgot to introduce myself. I get so excited about listening to Fanny. I am Sue Omby. I am the parent liaison with Knox County Schools for the special ed department. So I am going to kind of open up the chat box so I can see if anybody's writing anything. I did put, Franny, I hope you don't mind, I did put your email also in the chat
Sure.
box, just because I want people to be able to reach you.
Mhm.
While people are thinking, Franny, if you don't mind just kind of talking a little bit, because I was listening to you, and one of the questions I hear a lot from parents, and I'd like you to kind of address it too, if you could, is when we're talking about the FBA, when we're collecting that data and trying to figure out that information, how long do you think it takes to kind of collect that data, and why do you think it takes as long as it does?
Gosh, so there's no like federal guidance on it says it needs to be done in a reasonable period of time, right? So, um, and reasonable, I really wish they would give more guidance about it. But and districts have their own policies around data collection, but generally it takes around 60 days, 45, 60 days. And so the reason it takes so long is because of all the things that they have to consider. It is, uh, I mean, you're looking at making appointments to observe the child, and the child has to be available during those times. And so scheduling can be quite difficult. They have to, if you can review on the state of Tennessee's website, the questions that they ask for you to present to the teachers, and that requires them to have time to really sit and reflect about the student, to observe and to collect some data of incidents that are happening. And then, of course, we have to talk with the parents and get that information back to meet with the student. I mean, it is a lot of information to consider. A well-written FBA takes a really long time. I mean, you're really trying to understand behavior when the child can't necessarily explain it to you. And then you have to write a behavior intervention plan, which is very intense as well, and takes a lot of consideration as well. It takes a long time. And it's hard because, it can take, just like with any evaluation at school, if we get started on it in January, we're already halfway through the year and we're getting closer to the end of the year. And it can be really hard for parents to wait for it. And it's hard for me to wait for it for my clients as well. But it's really important that we get a well-written one. And generally in Knox County schools, you will get a well-written FBA and BIP, which you can't say in every county, to be honest. So I've seen some
Okay.
doozies, so.
So in the chat box, I'm getting a lot of thank yous for the presentation, the resources. We have just a few more minutes, so I was going to give people a little more time. We are going to be doing another parent training. They usually are about the third Monday, excuse me, yeah, third Monday. Today's Monday, all day. Third Monday of each month, so you're welcome to come and join those. We usually announce them in the newsletter. If you're not getting the newsletter, please let us know. You can shoot me an email, and my email is, and I can put it in the chat box as well, but it's sue.onb@knoxschools.org. So I will put that in the chat, and I'm going to give us just a few more minutes to see if anybody else has questions or wants to add anything else. All right. Well, Fanny, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming and sharing that information with me and with the group. If there's any other questions or concerns, of course, you can reach Fanny, and she is a wonderful person to talk to. I actually reach out to her a lot. She's actually an expert in trauma as well as a lot of different other things, as well as education. So she's a very good resource. And we hope to see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.